Your heart will tell you. Your feet touch the threshold of our house of life.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and I'm just thinking one day I want to be in that beautiful space with the Stryker Center in Temple Emmanuel. I'm actually here at the Forward office in downtown Manhattan for the first time in a long time. That's Abka Khan, our founding editor-in-chief, over my shoulder, and I'm just thrilled to be in partnership with the Stryker Center to present this incredibly interesting panel on a topic that I know many of you are, all of you obviously, and many of the public are totally always interested in, which is coverage from Jerusalem of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. I'm seeing in the chat that people are not able to see me, but my video's on, so I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm going to just keep rolling with it, and I'm sure our tech folks are going to make it work. So welcome, and thank you for joining us in the middle of the day. If you're on the East Coast, one of our panelists is in Jerusalem and another one on the West Coast. So we are spanning time zones here. As I said, I'm editor-in-chief of The Forward. The reason I'm hosting this panel, though, is that plus from 2012 to 2016, was the Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times. And that job has been variously described as the most important journalism job in the world, and very frequently described as the most scrutinized, most heavily and carefully scrutinized journalism job in the world. It certainly is the hardest job I've ever had in my many, many years of doing journalism. So I was thrilled when Gadi Levy of the Stryker Center asked me to convene a group of colleagues, current and former international correspondents who've done the same beat, to reflect and share their experiences and talk with you about why it's so hard and how they navigated the very sometimes troubled and troubling waters of covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for mainstream media outlets. I know some of you are still having problems with the video. They are working on it. I'm going to just do a little bit of tachlis before we jump in and I introduce the panel. This is a webinar. The chat is, you can use the chat in order to share questions that you would like for me to ask the panel. And Ari and Erica from the Stryker Center, who helped us put this program together, will be surfacing those questions for me. I'm going to start out with some of the questions of my own, but you are certainly welcome to jump into the chat with some questions and we'll get to them. Eventually, we'll be together for about an hour. And I see now people are saying they can see, which is terrific. So welcome again to this discussion live from Jerusalem, the trials and tribulations of international correspondents for various media outlets. As I said, this panel that I'm about to introduce together, the four of us have basically about 50 years of on-the-ground experience covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other parts of the Israeli experience, Middle East. And I'm really very excited for the conversation. So we have with us today from Jerusalem, Daniel Estrin, who is the only one of us who is still day-to-day in this battle. He has served as NPR's international correspondent in Jerusalem since 2017. You'll probably recognize his voice, and he has reported from the Middle East for more than a decade. He was with the AP before NPR for 7 years. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you.
And then we have Janine Zacharia, who reported on the Middle East for about 2 decades, including she was Jerusalem bureau chief for the Washington Post. She was State Department correspondent for Bloomberg News. She was the Washington bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, and she was Jerusalem correspondent for Reuters. Janine now, she's in Palo Alto. So thank you for getting up early, Janine. And she is a lecturer at Stanford University in the Department of Communication. And
hi, Jodi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And finally, we have Ethan Bronner, who was my immediate predecessor as Jerusalem bureau chief of the New York Times from 2008 to 2012. He also was the Jerusalem-based correspondent for the Boston Globe in the 1990s and for Reuters in the 1980s. He was deputy foreign editor of the New York Times, and he now is a senior editor at Bloomberg, who's focused on international politics. So as I said, we have a collective 50 or so years of doing this, which is, I think, impressive, or I don't know. It's a lot to carry around. And here we are, ready to share with you. I'm going to start with Daniel, since you're the one still in the thick of it every day. And it has, I started thinking, it's been an intense few months on your beat, but it's like, when has it not been an intense few months on this beat? But I would love you to share with us, reflect a little bit with us on your experience covering the war between Israel and Hamas militants in Gaza this May, and how it was different for you or similar to when you were covering the 2014 war for the AP. You can start there. And we also want you to talk either in this answer or we'll come back to you about, politics. 4 elections in 2 years. All of us covered Netanyahu as prime minister, but now you've covered him as prime minister and this transition to a new government. So there's a lot going on. Give us your from the ground reflections of the last few months.
Thanks for the question. Can you hear me okay? Great. So let me try to paint a picture of what it looked like and what it felt like in real time to report this story of 11 days that I think captured headlines around the world. It felt like a marathon that you didn't even know that you were running. The experience in 2014, I was part of a large bureau of the Associated Press. This is an experience as the bureau chief for NPR, where you find yourself in a lot of places. I found myself at the Damascus Gate, the elaborate gate of the old city of Jerusalem, all decorated in Ramadan lights. There were tough police crowd control measures that Palestinians were demonstrating seeing it as a religious affront. And I would dodge and smell this foul smelling water that Israeli police trucks would spray, just drenching the entire plaza. At that point, jumping into the car, going to the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which I'm sure you've heard about, where I witnessed what almost looked like a food fight between Israeli activists, settlers on one side, Palestinians on the other, hopping into the car, basically running into a street fight scene where I saw young Palestinian boys and young Israeli boys basically throwing rocks at each other, fires around the corner. It was chaotic, and that was just the beginning. I found myself at a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem, meeting people who had lost their eyes when police had fired tear gas canisters at the Al-Aqsa Plaza, Temple Mount. A Jewish ultranationalist march, and then being out there with the Israeli marchers when the first rockets were shot, and dodging kind of behind a trash bin, and suddenly you find yourself covering a war. And I found myself organizing my own troops, working with 2 journalists in Gaza, a journalist in Ramallah and a journalist in Jerusalem. And a lot of us, especially the ones in Gaza, were not sleeping. They were up at almost all hours of the night, terrified. There were loud booms around them. Some of them would rush to the scene of a strike and the aftermath to interview survivors. And then meanwhile, I'm waking up at very early in the morning and driving to a place like Lod, where it felt like the cities where Arab and Jewish residents live alongside each other were imploding. And I saw cars that looked like carcasses. And I met a Jewish woman in the supermarket who had rushed into the hallway with her kids, not only witnessing the riots inside the city, but then when there were air raid sirens, rushing out into the hallway, meeting her Palestinian neighbor, them hugging each other's children, jumping into the car from there and going to the scene of a house where a rocket had just struck a few hours before, and seeing the picture frame on top of an empty aquarium of the young teenage girl who was killed. And all of that, trying to wrap my head around it and synthesize what I saw in time for the 5 a.m. newscast on NPR's Morning Edition, which was noon my time, where I'm in my car balancing this microphone in between the steering wheel and trying to deliver the most updated news. So it's an experience of emotional turmoil with the people that you're working with your own neighbors. Going out in the morning on the balcony, and there are Israeli neighbors on the balcony, one saying, it's so terrible to see what's happening to all those people in Gaza, and the other saying, yes, but it's better that it's them and not us. So you experience this war not only as a journalist, but through the eyes of the people around you, the people who are the most dear to you. A Palestinian citizen of Israel I know whose Israeli Facebook friends were starting to write, "May they all become extinct." And Jewish friends who had moved to Jaffa because they felt that they wanted to be they wanted their children to grow up next to Arab residents, and then sending their kids away for their safety. So in the midst of all of that, your job, my job, was to observe, to listen, to ask, to reflect. And as looking back on it, you're a human trying to do something superhuman. You are trying to enter the eye, see what's going around you through the eyes and the perspectives of all kinds of people who you are not. You are trying to tell a story through all those perspectives as kind of the God narrator, as it were. But you're just a human. You're just as frail and flawed as the people you're covering. So I hope you get the sense of just the maelstrom, the chaos that it felt like I was covering, all the while, of course, in very intense discussions with my own editors about what they're seeing on social media, me fighting to get my original material up front and center on the air, discussions about, are we getting enough diversity of voices and perspectives of this conflict on the air? All those conversations that I'm sure all of you are familiar with from your own newsrooms. And then that's just, that's 11 days of conflict, and then the day of the ceasefire. I'm going to set aside the
political question for now, Daniel, because you gave us so much to think about. I love you're just like you do on the radio, just building us, real full images with your words. So thank you for that. Ethan, I want to turn to you for a second. You have this long kind of generational view, having been there 3 different times for 3 different news organizations in 3 different decades. And then now for almost 10 years, watching the coverage, watching the story, you continue to go back to Israel, I think both as a reporter and as a citizen, as a person, and you're as expert a reader as they come. So I wonder if you can reflect, jumping off of what Daniel just said and what you've absorbed in the last few months of this coverage and it's the war, it's COVID, it's the politics. All these stories have been huge in the international media, the Israeli version of it all year. What are the big picture shifts or changes in how the coverage is executed, how it's handled, how it's framed, and how the public is responding? And what do you attribute some of those changes to? What do you see as the kind of big picture here over time?
Okay, thank you, Jodi. On one foot, as the rabbis say. I'll try to do it as efficiently as I can. Actually, I first started visiting Israel in 1965. So there was no television there, and the food was horrible. And people were poor, and they were so poor they were wearing those little short shorts. They didn't have enough money to buy actual trousers, apparently. So, and then of course, my first time as a reporter there was in 1983, and there were 30,000 settlers in the West Bank in Gaza, and they seemed like people who had no future. They would get together in little trailers and make overheated coffee and try to persuade reporters like me that they were important and they had a future. And in fact, they were, and they did, and we didn't fully understand it at the time. So a lot of things have changed. I think another thing that's important for me as I look at the broad picture is this notion that for many years, the very strong geopolitical outlook in this country was that what happened in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict actually was central to U.S. interests in the region and actually globally. In fact, when President Obama, his first weeks in office, his National Security Advisor, Jim Jones, was telling those around him that if there was a single international issue that he wanted the administration to tackle, it was the Israeli-Palestinian one, because it was solvable and it was central to U.S. interests in the region. And in fact, of course, I think that this has proven to be something of an illusion. In the last decade, we've seen the Arab Spring and a whole bunch of other things that show that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not necessarily the core issue in the Middle East, not the core conflict. And that doesn't make it, for Jews and for people who care about the region, for Arabs, for Muslims, for whatever, doesn't mean that it's not an important conflict. Doesn't mean that it's not a morally challenging conflict. But the idea that somehow how Israelis treat Palestinians is central to American interests, I think, has fallen away. That's a huge change. Now, it doesn't, interestingly, I'm not sure it has changed how we cover it or how people look at it in this country. And I'll just tell you one quick anecdote, and then you can ask Janine something. And that is that when I was there as the Times reporter and from 08 to 12, I used to come back a couple times a year, and I did address groups. And one time before I left Israel, an Israeli friend of mine said to me, "So whom are you going to talk to?" And I said, "I'm going to talk to community groups and to colleges and so forth, and Jewish groups." And he said, "Well, you tell those college students that Israel is not a fascist apartheid state." I said, okay, I won't. I will tell them that. "And what do you want me to tell the Jews?" He said, "Tell the Jews it is." So I found that fascinating because the fact is that you can look at this conflict from many perspectives, and your audience does matter. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you for that, Ethan. That's really interesting. Janine, you share this long view, almost as long, and you went to work in the Mideast for the first time after Oslo was signed. You told me your first big story was the Rabin assassination, and then you were back in the 2010s on the ground covering the Gaza flotilla and other events. And now you've been teaching a course. One of the courses you teach there is on international correspondence, and you mentioned that you do not talk much about Israel because you like to focus on underreported places. And I would love it if you could put the beat sort of into context for us. Is it covered more than other places? It seems like, yes, you think it is. Why? And do you think it is covered any less fairly than Africa or China or Russia? How do you see it when you put it into that context for your students?
Thanks, Jodi. I mean, yeah, if you start with the present, well, let me work my way up to the present, just to give a little bit of that background. So after I graduated from Middlebury College, I went straight to Israel and I worked at the Jerusalem Report. And so this was, the summer of '95, just a few months before Rabin was assassinated. And actually, so like my career, so I had that '90s, and then I went to Reuters in Jerusalem. And then I was for the Jerusalem Post in Washington. So I had that perspective. And then I was back in Jerusalem a lot when I worked at Bloomberg, and then eventually for the Washington Post. So I did see this sort of, from different perspectives at different times, but always the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I would say, got enormous coverage, outsized coverage compared to a lot of places. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, despite what Ethan said, right, that it was, well, actually, Ethan was making the point about how it was the core, and then suddenly it wasn't the core. It's consistently has a lot of people based there. One is access. You do have better access in a place like Israel and the West Bank and Gaza than you do in Syria, where I was unable to get a visa, though I traveled to most of the rest of the Middle East, except Syria and Iran, where I couldn't get visas, or it became too dangerous in some respects for me. And the other reason is, of course, because of the enormous interest. I mean, look at the number of people registered for this webinar today. So it's a story that is core interest for a lot of American viewers and readers, of course. So, I mean, just to reflect for a moment, first of all, it's an enormous opportunity to report on this. We're going to focus a lot on the backlash, the criticisms, but it was such a privilege for me to be able to report on this every day, and in many ways, a complete joy to get to know all the peoples of the region. It's a story that is very difficult, and I loved how Daniel outlined the goals of the journalist on the ground there: to observe, listen, reflect, analyze. That's the job. And when you have all that incoming information so quickly, and Daniel's job is even more difficult now than, say, for me and Ethan, because of the how much you have to get out on social media now. And Daniel only has 30 seconds or 45 seconds to distill everything he just saw and what he witnessed in those 12 hours, right? The choices that Ethan and I made, though, about how to lead the story, which voices to include, everything is so heavily scrutinized in a story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict compared to, say, a story about Kinshasa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, simply because people are more immersed in this. They have their own judgments and values and what they want to see reported. I noticed the chat's going crazy already, right? But someone said, why do you, Jodi, refer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as opposed to the Israeli-Arab conflict? When I went on Democracy Now! For something, someone said, why don't you say Palestine? Why do you say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So the choice of language in each story is heavily scrutinized. And so it's a story at its core, I believe, of dueling narratives, and very often dueling victimhood narratives that Daniel expressed. And so depending what you lead with, what you focus on that day, people tend to take a whole judgment view of what you're saying. Now, the reason, just to quickly answer your question of why I don't focus on this when I teach foreign correspondence at Stanford, is because there is so much coverage of this. I mean, it's not that we don't talk about it. My students are watching right now. I signed them to come. But I think right now, one of my goals is how do we take underreported stories from abroad, using all the marvelous storytelling tools that we have at our disposal, and make Americans engage at the same level with those stories about Uyghurs, about Afghanistan, about Africa, that we do on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's what we study at Stanford.
Thanks, Janine. A couple people are asking us how many people are here, and we have more than 1,000 people signed on right now. There were some 3,500 people signed up. We also have people watching us live on Facebook, on the Stryker page and on the Forward page. And we are going to record this video. It'll be available, continue to be available on the Stryker website and also on YouTube. So if you want to share it with your friends. I want to pick up on some of the things that Janine mentioned, and that some things that are in the chat. So Janine pointed out that some people in the chat are already asking questions about the language that we use, Israeli-Palestinian versus Israeli-Arab conflict. And Mark asked some question about Hamas. Why did I refer to Hamas militants? And Paula asked about Daniel recently referring to the Temple Mount as the third holiest place in Islam, but failed to mention that it's the holiest site in Judaism. Why did you omit that relevant information? Paula wants to know. So I want to turn, and I'm going to try to combine that with, so we all, I think, have confronted what Janine talked about, about the language issues, whether it's when to call something terrorism or a terrorist, whether how to use the word occupied in reference to which territories, or the word disputed. I used to call this conflict code, where words that have certain meanings in plain English don't have the same meanings when in regard to this conflict, or in journalism about this conflict. So I'm certainly interested in anything all of you want to share about your own experiences with those language issues. I think they are a proxy for what Carla Marcus just put in as a comment or a question. She says, I'm so sad and frustrated with how pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel the news media is, especially public radio and even the NYT. Each will have a small Israeli perspective piece, but nowhere near as long or expansive as the Palestinian perspective. Will you please address this? Thank you. I know this is a question that each of you have been asked maybe hundreds of times about balance. And I want all of us to be as honest and reflective and as self-critical as we can be. My view is that this generally is actually about the perspective of Carla and of the reader. That I can know there are the Israeli perspective pieces there, She doesn't notice it as much. It isn't as interesting to her or as surprising or whatever, or somebody has galvanized her or other people to focus on the other coverage. But I would love to hear your perspectives on, in the main, is the coverage balanced? And in the specific, when you were doing the coverage, and Daniel, you talked about this in this visceral today terms, how did you work on balance yourself? How did you figure out how much of the each narrative to tell, how to balance them in a story, in the body of work over time? How did you grapple with this question of balance? Who wants to start? Such an easy
I can
question.
do it very quickly if you like, and then move on to
Sure.
you, Daniel. For many, many years, Israel was seen as the underdog, and American coverage of Israel very much reflected that in a kind of Leon Uris Exodus approach. So a lot of what I think people are concerned about is the sense that journalists tend to line up power questions very quickly, so that the underdogs, those who are out of power, getting a more sympathetic coverage. And so Israel began that way. Israel, in fact, in the last 30 years has become a rich and powerful country. And the perspective has shifted to some extent to those who are, and so the notion that the Jews need this land has moved from hunger to appetite. And there's this sense of, do they need every inch, and are they being greedy? And what about the people whose rights are being trampled upon in that process? So I think that that's partly what has happened, and the language has reflected that too. That there was a growing sense that this is basically a human rights dispute right now. That Israel is, ought to be able to. For years, the Jewish, those who were pro-Israel would argue that Israel was an existential danger from its neighbors and terrorists, and it's hard to argue that today. And so therefore, the notion arises, well, why don't you then do what you need to do for the Palestinians? So I think that's a lot of what's happened in terms of the shift of the coverage.
I can add to that when we speak about language, my colleagues at some other US media organizations tell me that they are having internal discussions right now in their newsrooms about the very language, the very words that they use, especially around the recent Gaza-Israel conflict. And one specific example is, do you refer to Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel? And I know that that's a discussion that is happening right now in newsrooms, and it reflects, I think, the discussion happening in newsrooms around new terms like capitalizing Black, issues around racial justice, and that affects the conversation on this story too. I would say that, I like to think about who my audience is, and my audience is people who are savvy and live on the coasts and are passionate and know this story and have been here, and maybe feeling defensive when they're listening and they hear a story that focuses on one side, but what about this other side? I tend to believe that the majority of my listeners are actually people, the lawyers in Iowa and the dentists in St. Louis, who really just are curious and want someone to explain this to them. And so when we talk about conflict code, I think you mentioned that, Jodi, about the terms that we have to feel that we have to use in order to kind of wink or to nod to the different sides and the terms that they prefer. I think it's possible to be fair and to be elegant in nodding to the terms that both people and both sides, for a simple way to put it, use, but also just use plain language, and also to just observe what you see in front of you. And so for me, especially with radio, it's so much about painting a picture and creating a sense of atmosphere and giving people kind of just a sense of place, that sometimes the language choices that I make that are important to me are, like, I'll tell you, when I entered Gaza for the first time and when the ceasefire was declared and just looked at what I saw around me, I saw a family in their best clothes, and they were all matching clothes. They were all pink. They're all wearing pink. Daughters, father, mother, and they had just emerged from their home after 11 days of bombardment. And to me, emphasizing that they were all wearing pink was something that just shows the freshness of that these are not symbols. We don't want to make the people we write about symbols. They are actually people experiencing these events. And so I also think about that when I think about language.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you for doing that. I think one of the things that sometimes can get lost in these discussions is just the critical value of on-the-ground reporting and the expense of it and the bravery required for it and the tirelessness, as you described earlier, and how important that is. I also think it feels to me like, sometimes I liked what you thought about the dentists and the lawyers. I mean, I do think that mainstream journalism is not necessarily really for hyper-focused activists on any issue. The folks who are on many listservs getting lots of information about this place. It's really for the kind of general interest reader, right? And so I think people who are super activated on one side or another of any issue, we don't want them. I mean, I always want to please them too, but in some ways, it's kind of not for them. I know for me, one of the issues with the conflict code question really was you want to. The more you learn about what the hot button terms or things are that are going to spawn some social media attack campaign on you or whatever, the more you want to avoid those things and just use, as you said, plain language. But then you find yourself in a little bit of a defensive crouch, writing kind of to protect yourself from attack rather than to explain to the dentists what is going on. And I'll just underscore one other thing that you said before moving on, which is one of my other predecessors, James Bennett, who was the Jerusalem bureau chief for the Times in the Second Intifada, wrote this really beautiful, very powerful memo about the question of when to use the word terrorism and not. And what he talked very similar to what you said about what I tried to do was just describe what I saw and what had happened in as much detail as possible and let readers draw the conclusions for themselves. But he ends up in the memo saying, like, at some point, to not say something is terrorism is also a problem. And it really, I don't know, it's an onion, it's one of those problems that's very knotty. Janine, I want to turn to you for a little bit of a very contemporary version of this issue, of a couple of these issues, which is the case of Emily Wilder, who was an AP reporter in Arizona, who was recently fired after around the Gaza war. What happened to Emily was one and a half things, I think, as I understand it. Emily had been a student at Stanford, a student of yours, and we'll get to that in a second. While she was there, she had been an activist in some pro-Palestinian causes, and some pro-Zionist groups seized on that and did a sort of social media attack campaign focused on her. There also was caught up in that was a tweet that Emily put out herself during this period that actually was about this question of language, right? Of what language the AP and other mainstream organizations use to describe the conflict. In the aftermath of this, you were a very important spokesperson or a thought leader on what had happened and what we could learn from this. As I said, she had been your student, so it was personal for you, but you also brought to this in a piece in Politico some really big picture analysis and thinking about what this incident showed us about the kind of decline in discourse around this and around journalism in general in the social media era. So can you share with us some of what you think are the real takeaways from the Emily Wilder incident?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time we want to spend on the details of the case, but basically, a young news associate in Arizona was fired by the AP 17 days into her tenure after a social media campaign started by the Stanford College Republicans, escalated by right-wing media like the Washington Free Beacon and people on Twitter like Ben Shapiro and Tom Cotton, that were using examples of what she had written in the Daily and activism she had done as a student as a way not only to take down Emily Wilder, but to attack the AP and the AP's credibility on reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at a moment, and this is what was most significant, just days after Israel had bombed the AP bureau in Gaza. Okay, and so there were people who were seeking to justify that attack by saying the AP is biased. And so the AP was on heightened alert on this whole conversation about bias and whatever, and she got kind of caught up in it and she was fired. Okay, and so for me, again, it was personal. She was my student at Stanford, very talented young reporter, didn't even have a beat, was based in Arizona. She was doing like data work. And somehow she was taken down by this. And it became really a question about, okay, well, if you're not going to, who are we going to allow to report in general? Okay. And why is it that because she did Palestinian activism, human rights activism at Stanford, she can't be a reporter for the AP in Arizona? So what happens to all the wonderful students that I'm mentoring who went to Black Lives Matter protests, who went to other protests, the Women's March and all that? Does that mean they're disqualified? Or is it specific to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I believe there is something about this issue that rattles editors in a way that, there's a lot of turmoil right now, as Daniel mentioned, in newsrooms about what we're going to call things, who we're going to, and things are evolving, but there is something specific about this. When I was reporting all those years, we used to get, Ethan and I, emails, Ethan, remember, from Leo Rennert. I don't know if Leo Rennert, Jodi, maybe you got Leo Rennert emails. I don't know if he's still alive. It used to be very quaint. You'd get an email from Leo Rennert telling you how you were anti-Israel or whatever, and the same time I would get some emails from somebody telling me I was, too pro-Zionist. Like it was like every day, how many did you get on each side, right? It was so quaint. It's so quaint to take a walk in my inbox from these periods compared to what someone like Daniel has to deal with now, or what just happened to my student, Emily Wilder. It's really, at the end of the day, I know a lot of people on this call, I'm seeing what you're putting in the chat, think we're the worst and we're all biased and all that. But really, at the end of the day, these are people, hardworking journalists on the ground, trying to report on a very complex story. And yes, some days, like I did at the Washington Post, I did a story where I took a ride with a group of people who were trying to get to the beach in Tel Aviv from a little village outside Bethlehem. And it was a ride-along story where I went and you had to go through the checkpoints and you saw who, was allowed to go and who wasn't allowed to go, to give a feeling for the occupation, right? And someone might see that story and say, Janine Zakaria is anti-Israel. No, I was doing a slice of life about that day. Other times I had to cover horrific bombings in Jerusalem on bus 18, where I used to live in the 90s, and hear the bus blow up and had to go cover that, right? Okay, so there are days when there are different kinds of stories. And yes, I went to the Gaza Strip and I interviewed people from Hamas. And I remember distinctly one day sitting with a guy, a Hamas guy from the political wing, okay, sitting there interviewing him. He's sitting with his tie and he says to me, Janine, what do they think about us? I said, who? He said, people in America. I said, well, people who know what Hamas is, they probably remember you blowing people up, in Jerusalem in the 90s, right? He's like, well, that was so long ago, or that's what they think, right? So dialoguing, learning, what are they about? And then watching my coverage of like the flotilla in 2010, when there was an aid ship that came from Turkey, right? And be manipulated, used by different groups with different agendas, right? That's something that happens too. So I remember I took a picture of all the food that had been smuggled in through the tunnels, which I'd gone through the tunnels and seen the tunnel. And they said the food. And then there's groups that say, see, there's enough food in Gaza. See, the media's biased. No. Read the story. See what's going on. This is what happens. There's a blockade. There's a, you know what I mean? Like, so where people see agendas is really, it's efforts to tell this story in all its complexity from, yes, as many sides as possible. And now, whoever's saying now that it's all anti-Israel, just look at the changing narrative since the war in May. There is a fatigue right now with Israel's, like Ethan wrote, many years ago, the mowing the grass strategy of going into Gaza and just, the New York Times did an A1 story about life under occupation that, I don't know, Ethan, did you ever write that kind of take like that in that length? I mean, I didn't do it like that. I did pieces of it. They put the pictures of all the kids who were killed there's a change going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I agree with you that it's partly a reflection of the shift to the left of the United States, the Black Lives Matter reflection abroad. And one of the things that when I was a reporter in Israel and in this conflict, for the first years, most of the complaints were from the pro-Israel community. And then in the last 10 or 15 years, I would say that the pro-Palestinian community has become more sophisticated, and also social media made it democratized the ability to complain. And also Israel's strength and stability were so clear that it made it easier in a way to complain about what was happening to the Palestinians. But I think that, part of the problem too is, to what standard do you hold Israel? Do you hold it to the standard of Sweden or of Syria, right? And in a certain way, both need to be there. And that's part of the whole problem of how you measure Israel's handling of its situation. And, there was this long piece on the front page of the Times a day or two ago about the difficulties between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs or Palestinians of Israeli citizenship. Huge piece by Roger Cohen, right? The day before, there was this massive piece out of Libya by Bobby Worth, in which there isn't a single decent thing that occurs. It's all hell. Hell from word 1 to 10,000. Nothing. I mean, all they're doing is they're killing each other and torturing each other and putting hot coals on their faces. It's unbelievable. So against that, should we measure what it's like to be a Palestinian in Lod today? Or should we measure it against what it's like to be in Cleveland? And I don't think we have an answer to that, but it's a dynamic debate.
Speaking of Cleveland, we have a very important question for Daniel, which is, are you from New Rochelle? If you are from New Rochelle, Daniel, then your mother was somebody's pediatrician, and she is the loveliest person possible. So are you from New Rochelle?
I'm sure that Estrin is lovely. I just wrote in the comments, actually, I'm from Missouri.
Oh.
And I meant no geographical slight when I mentioned the other a couple minutes ago about savvy coastal listeners versus people who are not as familiar with the story, maybe in places like St. Louis or in the heartland. I think my parents are tuning in from Missouri right now, and they are savvy people.
Excellent. I'm going to go to some of the questions that we've got from the audience, some of them that are maybe a little bit more specific and less about these kind of existential, like how do we work on balance. Trisha asks, what are the sources from Palestine? She says, as there's no freedom of the press, it seems like all the news from Gaza and the West Bank would be state sanctioned. Are there reliable resources? And then David says, it has been written that any reporter who wants to cover the Palestinian side of the story risks losing his sources and job if he writes anything negative. Is that true? Whereas he says other than military censorship, reporters in Israel essentially have carte blanche. And Lawrence asks, one Israeli journalist recently wrote that a reporter who cannot speak the local language is not really able to report accurately and properly. Do we agree? So I will put those together to ask everybody to talk a little bit about what languages do you speak, and does it matter for reporters if they speak the local languages? B, what are some of the differences in how it is to report on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, whether inside or outside of Israel proper? And what about these specific things that were said about, what are the sources on the Palestinian side that are reliable? And is there comeuppance for reporting critically? And by critically, I don't mean negatively, I mean with a sharp eye on either side, really. So
comeuppance from who? Comeuppance from who? What are they? Who?
The question was about that you would lose your sources or lose your job if you kind of reported the truth about the Palestinian reality. So it's like, the questions are, how does language play into it? What are some of the differences about reporting in the different areas? Are there reliable Palestinian sources, and what are they? And can you report freely, or does that is it? Can you report freely? I
Let
guess.
me I'll take a quick swing at it, and then you can take it, Janine. I think there is an important distinction between what is available, information available in Israel, and information available in the entire Arab world, but we can stick to the West Bank and Gaza, if you like. Okay. As a foreign correspondent, we are not usually creating new facts. We are creaming off a conversation that's occurring within that society. Israel gets up every morning and screams at itself, okay? And you can sit there and turn on the radio and just take notes, and everybody's screaming at themselves, never get out of bed and produce a very fine story for your readers the next day. And it's not just that, it's also there are think tanks, there are universities, there are independent, all that stuff's going on. And what do people do? They look at conflict, they look at problems. That's what journalists and
every government office and every organization has an English designated spokesperson devoted to answering your questions.
Right. We have all of their cell phones, so it's no problem. Reporting on the difficulties in Palestinian society is difficult. There are not the equivalent think tanks. The journalists are not free. That is absolutely true. They are occasionally harassed by the government, and there isn't also the level of professionalism there that there is in Israel. So all of that is true, and that is a problem.
You're referring to the local journalists. The local Palestinian journalists are not free, but international journalists are free to operate, to work within those complicated systems, right?
I think that, so the other thing is, I think that if you live in Gaza, you are at risk to some extent if you were to probe too deeply. I would agree with that. I don't think if you go in and out, you're as much at risk, but the people we rely on who are there are more careful, and it does make for an imbalance. Now, of course, there's an imbalance in expectation anyway. People don't expect that the government of Hamas is going to be as honest as the government of Israel. So in a way, if you were to spend 6 months proving that the housing ministry in Gaza gives advantages to the relatives of the deputy minister, it's not even going to make the front page because there isn't an expectation of honest government in those places as there is in Israel. So it makes for a very imbalanced conflict. No, it's not fair. Not fair.
But it's not a journalistic unfairness. It's a real world unfairness.
I think it's legitimate to ask us to make that point when we write occasionally. I agree with that. But I think that there are a series of expectations and understandings that people don't even realize in their own heads when they come to the news.
So Daniel, tell us about the sources. How do you deal with some of those imbalances? Are there reliable sources in all the corners of this conflict, and how do you work them?
Well, I think it's always a challenge, and it's a different challenge on the Palestinian side versus the Israeli side. Like Ethan says, you can turn on the radio and hear a lot and not get out of your bed and write a great story, but then that's not a very fresh, original take now, is it? And so I think the challenge on the Israeli side is sometimes you feel like you're in a torrent of information, and it takes a lot of savvy to think about the angles that maybe the very robust Israeli media is not covering. And when someone asked about languages, I speak both Arabic and Hebrew. I don't think that's a necessity for any journalistic job. I think people who don't speak the local languages bring a fresh perspective and outsiders, fresh eyes to a place that someone with the intricate language ability doesn't. But those nuances and the languages that you bring, the people that you work with, I work with really smart local journalists who I wouldn't be able to do my job without their help, reading the news, telling me what they're seeing on their Facebook pages. I mean, today in 2021, it's not enough to be able to read a newspaper, and you have to have people on the ground who are talking to people. You have to be going out and talking to people and seeing things. So I think information comes from many different sources, and it is a complex environment, whether you're in the West Bank, where there are limited freedoms, where there is an Israeli occupation, and Gaza ruled by Hamas, and the difficulties of reporting something there and knowing that you can leave and your local journalist stays and can face a lot of questioning. from authorities there. So it's difficult, but it is entirely possible, I think, to tell a fair story. And I would ask a lot of the commenters, writing here, why don't you write about this angle? Why are you focusing on that? My job as a journalist is to help my audiences walk a mile in someone else's shoes and listen to a perspective that maybe they've heard a million times or maybe they haven't, and simply to listen to it and hold it and understand where they're coming from. And so I hope that we as audiences and consumers of media can also take a walk in a journalist's shoes and understand that we are, you sit with a settler in the most remote hilltop in the West Bank, and you meet a human, and you're just floored by them, and you leave and you think this is the most incredible human experience that I've witnessed. And then you go down the hill, and your job is to speak with a Palestinian who lives down the hill, and then you're influenced by them. And so I would just ask the folks watching to just consider it's a difficult but an incredible job, what we do, and it involves some superhuman feats of trying to hold multiple perspectives and just tell a fair story.
Thank you, Daniel.
Can I jump in, Jodi, quickly, or
Yeah,
you want
go
to
ahead.
move on?
Well,
I have to say
Go
something
for it.
quickly. When Ethan was saying, I have to push back on my dear friend Ethan a little bit. I remember when I was leaving Jerusalem late '99 to move to Washington. I was so excited. I was going to work for the Jerusalem Post, and I don't know who it was, but I remember I spent 4 or 5 years, 5 years basically reporting in Israel. And someone told me, like, Janine, when you get to Washington, you can't just call up every member of Congress on their cell phone and call them in the middle of the night and just get an interview with them, right? Like while it's hard, there's something exceptionally much easier about interviewing Israelis and Palestinians. Like I could call Mahmoud Zahar on his cell phone. I mean, these people are available, right? A lot of it is more of where I do agree with Ethan is like you're battling with the foreign editor back home, like to be like, okay, well, justifying the story, what I teach my students, what's your story about? Why are you doing it now? Why do we care? Right. And so I remember one time on a Gaza trip, and a Palestinian said to me, did you see what happened, Janine, in Akko? And I said, what happened in Akko? And she said, well, this guy beat his wife to death in the stairwell. And the Palestinians were so attuned to the day-to-day news on Reshet Bet or Galei Tzahal in Israel, like the Israeli radio, whereas how often do you even see in the Israeli media the stories about what is probably the most important for them, the internal Palestinian dynamic between Hamas and Fatah, with Mahmoud Abbas, 85 years old, about to die maybe, right? There's now, he's not in good health. Like there's no deep examination of that really, right? In terms of, so, Kal v'chomer, like to try and get that in the New York Times or the Washington Post, like I did it when I could, the internal Palestinian story. So, and I just encourage people who think the media is all biased and we're all anti-Israel and all that, take a look at the coverage collectively, okay? I'm just looking here, like in 2015, my successor, William Booth, did a story about here's what a Hamas summer camp, training camp, summer camp for teens looks like. Okay. There's plenty that there's going to be stories about settlers, and there are going to be stories about dead children when there's 2,000 people killed in a war in 2014. And there are going to be questions about whether that was really necessary or if there were human rights abuses committed. The same way when Palestinians fire rockets, that there's going to be questions about and we're just trying to report, what's happening. It's not some conspiracy against Israel, right? I mean, I just think that's what I want to say.
I want to jump in, Janine. We only have a few minutes left.
Mm-hmm.
And I have 2 big questions I want to ask. So we'll try to get through them quickly. So I'm taking a question from Irving. He says, how much of the reporting of your stories from Israel is directed by the editorial policies of your organizations? And I guess I want to take this opportunity. Please correct me if this is different from any of your experience, but there is no editorial policy of a media organization. I believe the way Irving is asking, in other words, our editorial policy is pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Or the editorial policy of the organizations that all of us have worked for is to tell the truth as fully and fairly as we can every day. So I mean, that's how I would summarize it. I'll open that up to each of you to talk about whether there was an editorial policy that you thought you were following and what it was. And I guess I would also ask you, and I'm going to give my own answer too, but it's just like, so what was your agenda? People always ask about your agenda. Remember one time I said, pushed back on someone. I said, there's no editorial policy, no agenda. They didn't tell me any marching orders of go make the Palestinians look good or the Israelis look good. So if I don't know the agenda, how can I be executing? They said, well, they don't have to tell you. You all just know, which I thought was a little ridiculous. But because my agenda when I went was to dimensionalize the characters of the conflict. I felt that because this story was so covered, there was a real caricature, and Daniel's talked about this some already, about settlers and about Palestinian prisoners and Palestinian stone throwers. And I just tried to bring humanity and dimensionality to a news story that had become so familiar. So that was my personal agenda. I wonder how any of you would define what your agenda was in going there, or how you would respond to Irving's question about editorial policies. And if you can do it on one foot, that would be great, because I do have one more big question if we have time.
Okay, I'm going to do this on one toe. So in terms of an editorial policy, it's a fair question because, of course, not NPR, but our newspapers do write editorials, opinion pieces that represent the publisher and the editorial board, but those are separate from the news pages. And it's hard for people to get their mind around that, but it is absolutely true that when you're on the news side, you don't care what's in the editorial pages and so forth. So now I will say, parenthetically, that I think that there is some bleeding going on in the right now, more than when I was at the New York Times. And generally, there is sort of a questioning underway of the notion of neutrality or objectivity on the news pages. This idea that actually what you called objectivity was basically white, conservative, male perspective, and we're expanding that, and that also includes stuff like the Palestinian perspective. That's for another Stryker Center conversation. In terms of the agenda, I think Daniel's description and yours, Jodi, are good to try to get the readers or the listeners to walk in the shoes of someone you don't know. The way I saw it, like you said, Jodi, the way I saw it was that because this is such a well-covered conflict, it was important to tell people who had a certain set of assumptions to force them to question those assumptions, and those are on both sides. And as Janine said, that whether it's to interview a settler or it's to interview, someone in the Politburo of Hamas, and sort of see this person's perspective in a slightly new way that would allow you to understand that the certitude with which you view this conflict is worth questioning.
I love that frame, Ethan. Thank you. Janine, and then we'll give Daniel the last word since he's the guy fighting it out every day still.
Let me just say something very personal, Jodi. I went to Israel in 1994 as a young woman. I went to Hebrew U. I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with this place. I knew I wanted to go there. I wanted to be a journalist. Being a journalist is the best job on the planet. You get paid to go, not a lot, but you get paid to go interview people and tell their stories, right? I wanted to do good work. I wanted to do justice to this. I wanted to tell good stories. And sometimes I wanted to beat Ethan as a competitor. And I wanted to be accurate. And I wanted to do the best I could, and I wanted, just everything everybody's been saying, right? It was a wonderful job. And I had the privilege also of going beyond throughout the Arab world during the Arab revolutions, covering history, right? There's no agenda. You write a news pitch list based on what's happening. There's murmurs that Israel might want, attack Iran. You research that, you investigate it. You talk to your editors back in Washington or New York. You pitch the stories. There's going to be a Supreme Court decision in Israel about this road that's reopening, 443. I want to go deeper about it. You discuss it with your editor. You write the story. I'm going to go down to Gaza for a few days after the flotilla. And, that's how it works. Okay. You pitch a story, you sell your editor, you work together on it. You do the best job you can. You get criticized by readers. You try to answer legitimate criticisms and you move on to the next story very quickly. And that's how it works.
Thank you, Janine.
Mm-hmm.
We have only about 1 minute left, Daniel. So I'm going to ask you to give us your, final words and then we'll wrap up.
I think what I do is a public service. I know that people are busy, they're shopping, they're doing the dishes, they turn on the radio. They want compelling, just clear understanding of what's going on. And the other truism that I realize is that sometimes in a story, things don't really make sense. And sometimes two conflicting things can be true at the same time. Reality is messy, and we're often compelled as journalists to try to explain it in a pretty package. And we're not perfect, but we do our best.
Thank you, Daniel and Ethan and Janine, three just terrific, amazing journalists, thoughtful colleagues, people who have been given so much to further public understanding of the conflict itself, of Israel as a place, and of the journalism around it. And thank you to the Stryker Center, Gadi Levy, Erica, and Ari for putting this all together. And thanks to our great audience. Thank you for being so engaged. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. I hope you'll return. We have the Forward and the Stryker Center are partnered on a series of events called Israel Therapy. Our last one is on August 18th. I hope you'll join us for that. That's where we're going to grapple with some of the emotional dilemmas that American Jews face in thinking through the complexities of Israel in their own reality and their own lives. Please also make sure that you're signed up to receive the Forward's newsletters, are free in your inbox every day. You can sign up at forward.com/newsletters, and please check both the Forward and the Stryker Center's websites for all the events, the live journalism events that we're doing together and independently. Thanks again for being with us. Thanks for staying up late, Daniel, and Janine getting up early. I guess it's not really late there, but in any case, and it's really great to be with you on Zoom. I hope everybody has a great rest of summer. And just again, thanks for your engagement. Bye.
Bye.
The recording